The service here is atrocious!
Well, this is, strikes me while I'm here that this is about the time of the year when my students are going around for job interviews, if they're lucky enough to get them. I say this is the time of the year when my students are going around for job interviews, if they're lucky enough to be invited. And if they are, they're expected to give a talk, technical talk, have a few questions. If they don't consult too many people on the faculty, they may even be offered the job. And I guess that's the same format. So I'll try not to insult too many of you, and maybe I have a chance at the award. We'll see. Every self-respecting president has a doctrine attached to his name. For the current incumbent in Washington, that's been expanded from a doctrine to visions and dreams as well. But most presidents, it's just a doctrine. These doctrines are interesting to investigate. They're often important. Time's short. I'll keep just to the current Bush doctrine, which happens to be unusually prominent, clearly articulated, very dramatically implemented, so there would be no doubt as to what it means, and widely discussed to an unusual extent. The Bush doctrine has several related components, all of them clearly articulated. I'll just quote. The first and most general component of it is that it is our responsibility to history to drive evil from the world. And that's a far-reaching doctrine. A special case of this has got to be a relentless war on terror, and furthermore, quoting, any state that harbors terrorists is a terrorist state and will be treated accordingly as we drive evil from the world. The third and more formal enunciation of the doctrine is the National Security Strategy of September 2002, which effectively declared the right to use force to eliminate any perceived potential challenge to U.S. global hegemony. As Colin Powell put it, the U.S. reserves the sovereign right to take military action where and how it chooses. He happened to say that in Davos at the World Economic Forum meeting, eliciting quite a negative reaction from the people who the business press, the international business press, call the masters of the universe, with only a slight touch of irony. The national security doctrine also, at the same time, the Bush administration made it very clear, some of the first aspect of the implementation of it was to make it clear where they stood with regard to international law and international institutions. Even before Powell's statement, the government had made it clear to the United Nations that it could be relevant, that was the term used, if it endorsed what the U.S. was planning to do anyway, or else it could be, as Powell explained, a debating society. But those were, in effect, the choices. Be relevant and endorse what we're going to do, or you can have polite discussions somewhere.
I'm told that some people at the back can't hear you very well. Would you mind using the handheld?
Okay. Is this going to interfere with the other one?
That's better, I think, is it?
Is that better? Shall I undo the other one? Okay. Well, this announcement to the United Nations of its choice between relevance and debating society actually has come to is right on the front pages of the press in England, not here right now, in the Catherine Gunn case. As I'm sure you know, Catherine Gunn is being tried because she leaked to the British press reports that she had seen from the American embassy calling on British intelligence to illegally tap members of the Security Council so that the United States would know how to coerce or pressure them into becoming relevant, that is, endorsing what the U.S. was going to do. Those of you who know the history of the United Nations will recognize that this is coming full circle. The San Francisco Conference, which established the UN, at that conference, delegations were also illegally tapped by the FBI so that the U.S. would be able to control the proceedings properly. So we now have a nice completion of the circle. But that expresses from the beginning and dramatically today the attitude towards international institutions and international law. And it's not very surprising. It's pretty much the way anyone would predict that the world dominant power would behave. It may be surprising to people who prefer illusions, but historically it's not a great surprise. The national security strategy, the formal version of the doctrine, it not only elicited great anger among the international business elite, but also among the foreign policy elite at home. So immediately after it was announced in September 2002, the major establishment journal, Foreign Affairs, a few weeks later, published its next issue with a lead article called describing what the author called the new imperial grand strategy, and warning that it was going to cause serious problems for the world and for the United States. Even before the doctrine had been officially announced, it was clear what it was going to be. Henry Kissinger had described the doctrine as what he called a revolutionary doctrine, which undermines the UN Charter, undermines international law, in fact, undermines the whole Westphalian system since 1648, which barred forceful intervention into other sovereign states. Of course, Westphalia was only for great powers. You do anything you want to anyone else. That was hardly observed very magnificently even among the great powers. But this, as Kissinger correctly pointed out, the new doctrine simply tears this whole framework to tatters, which he thought was a good thing. He basically supported the doctrine, but like many others many other of the critics in the foreign policy elite criticized the implementation, said reasonable position, but not the way the implementation has many flaws and will cause all sorts of dangers. Kissinger's a realist scholar, and he pointed out that we must not permit this doctrine to be universalized. It cannot become a universal principle. In simple words, this is a doctrine for the United States, which the right to use force at will against perceived or potential enemies is to be reserved to the United States. It can delegate that right to some of its clients, but no one else should line up for the privilege. That's clear and explicit. The national security doctrine was immediately followed by exemplary actions to make it clear to the world that it was meant seriously. It's not just rhetoric. The most obvious of them, and the one that attracted the most attention, was the invasion of Iraq. There were others to which less attention was paid, but that might, over the long term, prove more significant. One of them was the announcement, just weeks after the national security doctrine, the announcement by the Air Force Space Command U.S. policy in accord with the national security doctrine was going to shift from control of space, that was the Clinton doctrine, to ownership of space. So from now on, the U.S. would own space, not just control it. And then they went to spelled out what that difference is. It means that any potential competitor in space will be destroyed. And space means militarization of space, as they explained. We have documents leading up to it spelling it out. It means placing space platforms for highly destructive offensive weapons, nuclear and non-nuclear. This is under a first strike doctrine, which is official. The world will be under very tight surveillance by hypersonic drones, so you can tell if somebody's walking across the street in Bangkok and so on. And it means, in principle, a command post could instantaneously, without warning, attack and destroy any place in the world without much need for forward basing and other annoyances. And this system has to be owned, not just controlled. That was November 2002. The U.S. continued, meanwhile, to oppose unilaterally UN efforts to ban the militarization of space. This has been going on for some years. The most recent case was last December, when, again, unilaterally, with the reflexive votes of Israel and I think Micronesia, the U.S. opposed the otherwise unanimous decision to reserve space for peaceful uses. This has been going on for some years now. UN disarmament commissions have been deadlocked over Washington's refusal, it's back to Clinton, to ban militarization of space. However, the advance from control to ownership is a substantial one and in line with the national security doctrine, and very ominous in its implications. I mean, others plainly don't just say, oh, that's fine. Russia has already responded by sharply increasing its military spending, its offensive weaponry. It has moved to launch on warning automated response systems, which were dangerous enough in the past and are far more dangerous today with the deteriorating command and control systems of this Russian state as the economy collapses. Just to cheer you up, you may recall in 1995, before the deterioration had set in, we came 2 minutes from a missile launch, which probably would have destroyed much of the world. When there was a 10-minute countdown after Russian computers had misidentified a space rocket as a missile attack. It was aborted 2 minutes short of flight. Instant retaliation, presumably go beyond what Eisenhower predicted in the 1950s, that any such exchange would mean the destruction of the Northern Hemisphere. We've gotten much more violent and powerful since then. These dangers are being enhanced. Russia has also moved to a first strike doctrine. China is responding the same way as predicted. What's called ballistic missile defense is understood both by adversaries and by advocates in the United States as being an offensive weapon. It's called a shield, a sword, not just a shield on both sides. And the reaction to it is to build up offensive military forces, very threatening with the obvious ripple effects. Don't have to go into it. So these are all severe challenges, threats being significantly escalated, all implementing the same thinking. Can't just attribute it to the Bush administration, I mentioned has roots before, but the a sharp escalation of it is significant, very significant. The moonshot, the Chinese and American moonshots are very likely related to this. The moon is, if any of this gets off the ground, to use an appropriate metaphor, probably the moon will be used for military purposes as part of the militarization of space system. And the Chinese challenge to land a shuttle is a challenge to the U.S. official position of ownership of space, which does not lead to attractive consequences if you think it through. Well, let's get back to Kissinger and the justification for the revolutionary new doctrine and its implementation in Iraq. He gave the conventional justification. The justification is that Iraq possesses weapons of mass destruction and is connected to terror. Well, it's by now clear, even from the scandalous Hutton report, that Bush and Blair and their associates sexed up the intelligence reports, borrow the notorious BBC phrase, which elicited interesting hermeneutic disquisition from Lord Hutton, as you may have seen if you put yourself through the pain of reading the report. But that the intelligence data was sexed up is not seriously in question. And the purpose was to establish that Iraq was a dangerous, imminent threat because of its weapons of mass destruction and its ties to terror. Recall that that was presented as the only question, repeatedly, the only question by Colin Powell, Jack Straw, and others. And it's rather clear that they had to know at that time that any evidence they had was shaky at best. Now we know how shaky, but what is important is what they knew then. Well, the failure to find weapons of mass destruction has been significant, but I think its major significance has been somewhat overlooked. The main significance of the failure to find weapons of mass destruction is that the bars for aggression have been lowered. So the original doctrine was what Kissinger and the National Security Strategy stated. State countries that have weapons of mass destruction are too dangerous if they're, rogue states or whatever. Well, now you have to change the doctrine, and it has been changed. So it is now just the possession or the intent or ability to produce weapons of mass destruction is sufficient to justify aggression, the supreme crime of Nuremberg. That's a significant change because almost everyone has the ability. The high school in your local community probably has the ability to produce chemical and biological weapons, and the intent is just subjective evaluation, which means that anyone is subject to attack. That's been made even more clear just a few days ago by Condoleezza Rice, who reviewed what are now the official reasons that justify the attack against Iraq, and it's worth looking at them, not as a criticism of her, but to see what the conditions are that are now accepted for free aggression. According to her, the attack on Iraq was legitimate because it had used weapons of mass destruction in the past. She omitted conventionally the words "with our support." Those are never added. Secondly, it had attacked neighbors twice, again omitting the fact that the first attack was with our support, and the second attack was followed by U.S. authorization to Saddam Hussein to crush a Shiite rebellion, which might well have overthrown him, a fact which has an eerie similarity to what's happening right at this moment as the U.S., the CPA, is desperately evading the call of Iraqis for an election, in which the Shiite majority would obviously dominate. So that's the second reason. The third reason is that Saddam Hussein allowed terrorists to run in his country and was funding terrorists outside of his country. Well, she didn't bother providing evidence for that. We do have evidence, namely that it was false, but that now something like that is true. So the evidence that we have, and intelligence agencies and independent analysts pretty much agree on this, is that before the U.S. invasion, Iraq had kept quite far from the international terrorist organizations. But after the invasion, predictably, Iraq itself has become a terrorist state, another front in the so-called war on terrorism, and that recruitment for al-Qaeda-style groups has significantly increased. So as predicted, the war did increase the threat of terror and indeed succeeded for the first time in turning Iraq into a nest of terror. Her fourth argument is that Iraq has refused to account for its weapons of mass destruction, and Saddam concealed his programs. Well, that's partially true. Actually, Iraq was more closely investigated by inspectors than other countries which have anything like comparable programs. But that aside, there is another country in the region which has refused to account for its weapons of mass destruction and concealed its programs, even though it's well known that it has hundreds of nuclear weapons and is producing chemical and biological weapons, and is regarded as extremely hazardous, in fact, by the U.S. Military Command, Strategic Command, STRATCOM, but that one doesn't count because that's a U.S. client. So it's therefore free of any of these obligations. Another U.S. ally, as we have, has recently been made public, though it was known for a long time, Pakistan has been openly involved in illegal proliferation for years. It's all been quite public. Inconceivable that U.S. intelligence agencies didn't know. The worst of what's now being exposed was in the late 80s and the early 90s, and it's hard to imagine that the National Security Advisor at the time or the head of the Pentagon didn't know what was publicly available on the streets of Islamabad, meaning that the current Secretary of State and Vice President had to know about this right at the time. There's now a fuss being made properly because it is indeed extremely dangerous. Well, those are the four reasons for attacking Iraq. Run through them. They, in effect, eliminate any barriers to the use of force at will. Almost no pretense left. Well, let me drop that and turn to the corollary, the idea that states that harbor terrorists must be attacked to eradicate evil. Here we have to make an exception. We have to agree to exclude the category of harboring government officials. If we open that door, the doctrine instantly reduces to absurdity. So let's not talk about harboring government officials who are large-scale terrorists, and keep to harboring what are called subnational terrorists, those who aren't at the level of state planners or heads of state. So what about which countries harbor subnational terrorists? Well, there are many charges about pre-invasion Iraq, kind that I've mentioned and you've heard, but they're rather dubious, and there isn't much point paying much attention to them because there are some very clear cases of harboring terrorists, therefore terrorist states, where there's just no controversy. So take, for example, a case that's currently timely, the case of the Cuban Five, which ought to be front page news everywhere. Their appeal is coming up in about 2 weeks. What are the Cuban Five? Well, as I'm sure you know, the United States has been engaged in large-scale terrorist attacks against Cuba since 1959. The U.S. government direct participation in those attacks ended in the late 70s, at least officially. But since that time, instead of directly attacking Cuba, the United States has been harboring terrorist networks that attack Cuba. Well, again, this is not particularly controversial. It's accepted, for example, by the FBI and the Justice Department. So take, say, Orlando Bosch, who's now living happily in Florida. He is accused by the FBI of about 30 acts of terrorism, quite serious ones, like blowing up a Cubana airliner with killing 73 people and many others, some committed on U.S. soil. The Justice Department, U.S. Justice Department, regards him as a dangerous terrorist whose presence in the United States is a serious threat to the United States, and says that for 30 years he has been engaged in implementing or organizing terrorist activities. George Bush I gave him a presidential pardon at the request of his son, the governor of Florida, so that major terrorist is now carefully harbored in Florida. What about the Cuban Five? Where do they fit into this? In the early 90s, when it was clear that terrorist attacks were going to go on from there, Cuban agents infiltrated Florida terrorist groups for several years. At one point, the Cuban government informed the FBI that they now had large-scale information about terrorist groups operating in the United States. The FBI sent high-level officials to Havana, where they were given thousands of pages of documentation and hundreds of hours of video and audio tape documenting terrorist actions being planned and some carried out in Florida. And the FBI did react, namely by immediately arresting the people who gave them the information. That's the Cuban Five. They reacted by leaving the terrorist cells untouched and not pursuing the information, but arresting the informants who had infiltrated them and provided them with the information. 3 are now facing life sentences. Several spent a long time in, this went off, whatever that is, in solitary confinement. Their wives are not allowed to visit them, no visas. The government insisted on trying the case in Miami. The request for a change of venue was turned down. The foreman of the jury opened by saying that I regard Castro as a communist dictator, and other members of the jury went on. The prosecution conceded that they couldn't prove the case, but a Miami trial was sufficient. So that's the case of the Cuban Five, now coming up for appeal. Why is Cuba such a target for U.S. terror? Well, actually, that was explained nicely yesterday in the lead story of the Wall Street Journal. Take a look at the lead story. You see it described. It says that Cuba has been dedicated to the cause of derailing the U.S. agenda in Latin America, and therefore is a justified target for attack. Actually, the author of the story probably didn't know it, but he was virtually quoting from declassified CIA documents 40 years earlier, which explained the reason for the attack, at that time, extensive terrorist attack on Cuba, on the grounds that Cuba, that the very existence of the Castro regime is successful defiance of U.S. policies going back 150 years. So it just can't be meaning back to the days of the Monroe Doctrine, when the U.S. intended to take over Cuba. So no Russians, nothing like that. So obviously that can't be accepted, and the Wall Street Journal more or less has it straight when they say that the crime is the dedication to the cause of derailing the U.S.'s agenda in in Latin America. The same article of the Wall Street Journal goes on to say that Chavez in Venezuela is the heir apparent to Castro's cause of derailing the U.S. agenda in Latin America, which makes Venezuela, the successful existence of that government, an unacceptable, successful defiance of U.S. policies going back 150 years, with consequences that will be familiar to people who know about the history of this region. And again, it's timely. Just a few days ago, Venezuela sought extradition of two military officers who had fled Venezuela after they were charged with setting off bombs in Caracas. They're now here. Venezuela's asking for extradition. Two more terrorists harbored here for the moment. We'll see what happens with that. This is connected with the military coup a couple months ago, which was openly backed by the Bush administration, although it drew back when it aroused an enormous opposition in Latin America, and the military coup was overthrown. According to the British press, very good correspondents in the British press, Latin American specialists, they claim to have amassed evidence that the coup was instigated, or at least in part instigated, by three major figures of the Bush administration who have a long record of involvement in terrorist crimes in the 1980s, namely Elliot Abrams, Otto Reich, and John Negroponte. Their involvement in terrorist crimes in the 1980s, again, isn't controversial. For that, we can turn to the World Court judgment that Tony mentioned, and two Security Council resolutions endorsing the World Court judgment, which, of course, were vetoed by the United States, with Britain politely abstaining. Just to draw some conclusions, the Bush doctrine quite directly implies that the United States is a terrorist state and should be treated accordingly. It's obviously harboring terrorists. I gave a few examples, can easily add many others. Just to add one more, right across the river, there's a leading terrorist being harbored, Emmanuel Constant, who was the head of the paramilitary organization that was responsible for killing thousands of Haitians in the period of the military junta, which was supported not so tacitly by Bush 1 and even more by Clinton. Haiti has asked for they've sentenced him in absentia. They have asked for his extradition repeatedly. They never get a response. The general suspicion is that the U.S. doesn't want to extradite him because in a trial, his connections with the U.S. intelligence will come out. But whatever the reasons are, he's another terrorist harbored here. One might say that killing several thousand poor black people doesn't really count as much of a crime, so maybe it's not like other cases of harboring terrorists. Won't go into that. Well, without continuing, it's not very hard to evaluate the doctrine of driving evil from the world if we accept the condition of universality, but as Henry Kissinger accurately pointed out, that's an error. The doctrine holds only selectively. It's a doctrine that the powerful may invoke, but not anyone else. So therefore, you could say that all the examples I've given are completely irrelevant, and any others like them. As for the imperial grand strategy, I think its implications are as revolutionary as Henry Kissinger indicated. I think a good case can be made that the implications go far beyond, and that it should be a matter of rather considerable concern.
No, thank you very much. I hope we have time for a few quick questions. I know Hans Janacek wants to present you with a Medal of Excellence, but I think there are a few people who want to ask some questions. And normally I give myself the right to ask the first one, but today I won't hog the microphone, and I'll go to Ricardo Alday of Notimex first.
Yeah. Hi, Mr. Chomsky. Ricardo Alday from Notimex. I want to ask you two brief questions. What is, in your view, the risk of 4 more years of Bush, both inside the United States and for the international system? What the impact will be? And secondly, do you think Kofi Annan should cede to U.S. pressure to send back human personnel to Iraq? And does he have any room not to say, to say no? Thank you.
No, it's very hard to predict the weather, and predicting human affairs is extremely difficult. But there is a fair possibility, possibility beyond what I think any rational person would want to accept, that another 4 years of the same policies, it could be extremely dangerous for the country and the world, and could cause maybe irreparable harm. Remember, we have a lot of evidence. It's not just the past 4 years. The same people essentially were in office for 12 years, 1981 to 1992, and there is a rich record of what they accomplished. It is not discussed in the United States because we have a kind of a principle here that you're not supposed to look into the mirror. It's not unique to the United States, but very striking here. So anything that happened in the past didn't happen, okay, because we've changed course or some miracle has taken place. So we're therefore not permitted to carry out the rational approach that we would to anyone else. If Saddam Hussein appears in a trial and says, well, why are you bringing up all that old stuff from the 80s? It doesn't mean anything now. I'm a nice guy. I just had a born-again experience, and I'm going right to heaven. We wouldn't even bother laughing. But when that is done year after year after year, as it is, by our own leaders, we applaud. Okay, that's what it means to be a disciplined intellectual. And if we don't want to accept that discipline, we can treat the matter just as we would in the case of Saddam's crimes or Stalin's crimes or anyone else's. We can ask, well, what did they do during those 12 years, and what have they been doing the last 4 years, the more reactionary? It's a reactionary selection from the first 12 years, and it's clear enough. They have a domestic agenda, which is not hidden. They're trying to unravel the progressive legislation of the past century to overcome the achievements of popular struggles, hard ones, to gain some benefits for people, what we call a minimal welfare state, to transfer power into the hands of unaccountable private tyrannies in one way or another. Every aspect of the program is like that. Internationally, they have the programs that I've described. They may back off from them because they may find them unfeasible, but the programs are clear, and that's only part of them. There's also programs about international economic arrangements. I think these could be very dangerous. In fact, the kinds of programs I just talked about could literally lead to destruction of the species. Again, you can't put a probability on that. We don't know what the likelihood was of a devastating nuclear war in 1962, right? When literally the world was one word away from a nuclear exchange. One Russian submarine commander countermanded an order to shoot off nuclear-tipped torpedoes during the Cuban Missile Crisis, which very likely would have led to a devastating nuclear response, and then on, and then Eisenhower's destruction of the Northern Hemisphere. One word. That was 1962. January 1959, 1995 was much more dangerous, far greater destructive capacity. At that point, we were 2 minutes away. As these threats are being increased, militarization of space alone is increasing the threat significantly. Rational people don't take chances like that, and no matter what your subjective probability is, but it will increase.
Financial Times.
Sorry, on the coffee and Iraq.
Oh, well, basically no one has a right to be in Iraq but Iraqis. So they should take the lead in determining what happens. What the invasion has left such wreckage that how Iraqis might decide to deal with what remains, I can't say. I mean, we know what they say in polls, and you can make your own judgments from that. In recent Iraqi polls, the most favorable rating for a foreign leader is Jacques Chirac. By about 5 to 1, they regard the U.S. British forces as occupiers, not liberators. Right after Bush made his speech about how we're changing course once again and going to bring democracy to the world, actually reiterating what Reagan had said 20 years earlier and everyone else. After that speech, which was greeted with the usual reverential awe in the United States, there was a poll in Iraq about asking Iraqis why they thought the U.S. was in Iraq, and some agreed with President Bush and the commentators here. 1%. 1% thought that the goal was to bring democracy to Iraq. About 70% thought it was to control Iraq's resources and to reorder the Middle East and consistently with the goals of the United States and Israel. Actually, their responses were more nuanced and sophisticated. When it went further, it turned out that about half, although 1% thought the U.S. was trying to bring democracy, about half thought that the United States wanted democracy if the U.S. could control it. Now that's the sophisticated response, the one that's based on history, the one that is understood by everyone in Latin America, for example, or the one that Iraqis understand perfectly well from their own history. I'm sorry, they were free, under British rule since the 1920s. But they know, without reading British secret records, that they were granted freedom on the grounds, the internal British records, that they would be an Arab facade behind which Britain would rule with various constitutional fictions and so on, and same in Central America and the Caribbean. Yes, you can be free and democratic as long as you do what we say. And I presume that's the reaction of Iraqis, and usually the victims have a reasonably good understanding of the world. The people holding the hammers and guns usually don't understand very well. But I think we should try to respond to their understanding. And if they want UN officials there, a UN force there, okay. I mean, if they want military forces from the region to try to control the miserable security situation that's resulted from the invasion, okay, that's their decision. If they want to accept the economic program that has been rammed down their throats by the CPA, which no sovereign country would accept, just opening the country up to complete purchase by foreigners, meaning mainly U.S. corporations. If they decide they want that, like they want to commit economic suicide, all right, fine. If they decide they want the kinds of social and economic programs that every sovereign state with any independence pursues, that's fine too, then we throw that out.
Actually,
and so on down the line.
Ahmad Chalabi was in this room not so long ago, and he told us he loved the program.
He may. I mean, that program will have, we know what effect such programs have. Those are the programs that created the third world. I mean, if anyone who knows any economic history knows that, say, 200 years ago, there wasn't much difference between what's now the first world and what's now the third world. Actually, India and China were the commercial and industrial centers of the world. Europe was kind of backwards in most respects. But now they're very different, hugely different. How did it happen? The European states, the developed states, England, United States, France, Germany, Japan, the one country that resisted colonialism, up to the East Asian, tigers, without exception, they radically violated the principles of economic liberalism. They insisted on massive state protection and subsidy, just as the U.S. economy does today. They were very highly protectionist and interventionist. On the other hand, they forced what is now the third world to accept economic liberalism, the program that Chalabi wants, an extreme form of it. And it had the predicted effects. So at the end of 200 years of British rule, India was not the commercial industrial center of the world anymore, from which Britain was stealing technology and so on. It was an impoverished peasant country with mortality rates about the same as they'd been 200 years earlier. It began to develop afterwards, but it could follow its own principles. However, in every one of these third world countries, every one, there is an elite which is extremely wealthy and privileged, serves the interests of the foreign masters, and they do just fine. You go to the poorest country in sub-Saharan Africa, and there are people living at a lavish lifestyle we can't dream of. So in Iraq, too, under this system, there will be such people. The ones working with the foreign bankers and international investors and with Halliburton and so on. They're going to have local managers.
No, and we're fast running out of time. There are various people who want to ask questions. I see 3 hands that I can identify. I think there are more back there. I'd like to take 3 questions, and then I think what I should do is allow those who want to leave to leave. So I'm going to recognize the Financial Times, the Iranian News Agency, and Tempo. And any others who want to ask any questions, I'll ask you to pause. We'll have the medal ceremony. Those who want to leave can leave, and those who want to stay and ask any more questions, if you can bear to do it, then we'll let you do that. The other thing is, perhaps I could ask you to be a tad briefer in your responses.
Never hear that.
Financial Times.
Actually, I was going to ask 2 questions, but I'm just going to ask one now. Very specific question. I was very interested in the stuff you're saying about space. Do you have a sense of where the debate is going now in the United Nations in terms of, it's just something I haven't followed and almost didn't hit our radar screen, and what's going to be coming up over the next year? Thanks.
Well, that's a very easy one to answer. Just take a look at the last debate was December at the General Assembly. It's the first committee, I guess, the Committee on Space and Disarmament, which is essentially the full General Assembly. It was last December. There were several resolutions that came to the fore. One was a reiteration of the effort to ban militarization of space. I don't remember the numbers, but I think it was voted something like 174 to 3 or something like that. U.S., Israel, and some Pacific island. There was another important resolution which called for removing weapons of mass destruction from the Middle East. And that was also voted overwhelmingly. Again, I don't remember the numbers, but overwhelmingly with the U.S., Israel, and maybe a Pacific island opposed. But you can look at the debates; they're right there on the UN record, and that's been going on for years. The first committee, the Disarmament and Security Committee, I think it's called, has been meeting regularly for 6 or 7 years, and has been hung up on the question of militarization of space. Everyone on the committee, is led in part by China, but it's been essentially unanimous, has been trying to put some teeth in the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, which does loosely reserve space for peaceful uses. And they want to enforce that and strengthen it. And it's been blocked all the way by the United States, all the way. And there is no reporting on this in the United States, actually, virtually none. I had some friends do database searches. You find a little newspaper in Utah that mentioned it or something. So it's basically unknown. But it's public.
Is anything coming up? Is there anything
new coming up? Yeah, the Disarmament Committee will continue to meet. And the General Assembly, they'll continue to meet, but they can't do anything if the United States vetoes it. I mean, the same is true on the Outer Space Treaty itself. There is a 1967 Outer Space Treaty, which is not terribly specific, but the implication of it is to prevent the use of space for military purposes. For a long time, nobody did much with it. A few years ago, efforts started coming along in the General Assembly to ratify it again, re-ratify it. The reason was the recognition that the U.S. intends to violate it. And it's come up year after year, I forget how many now. That one the U.S. doesn't vote against, it abstains. Everyone votes for it, and the U.S. and Israel abstain. Okay, Israel doesn't matter, but a U.S. abstention is in effect a veto. Okay? A double veto. A U.S. abstention vetoes the proposal and vetoes it from history, which is why you don't know about it. So it's not reported and not discussed and so on. So the double veto has succeeded in blocking efforts to, so I said abstain. But when the U.S. abstains, it's in effect a veto. It's because that means it's not going to happen. Okay? When the most powerful state in the world says, not going to have anything to do with this, that's in effect a veto, and in fact a double veto, because reporting is also effectively vetoed, and it disappears from history. And that's been the course of the issue of militarization of space for probably 5 or 6 years. And this goes back to the Clinton administration. All of this is completely public, incidentally. So if you read if you take a look at the website of the Space Command, that's open. Back around 1997, it's a Clinton era, the Space Command announced clearly its programs for then control of space, not ownership of space. Now it's up to ownership. For control of space, very lucidly, I mean, like kind of reading like a little Maoist red book. It said the U.S. must have military control of space to protect our investments and commercial interests. Okay, and then it went on to give a little bit of history. It said in the past, countries needed armies and navies, like Britain, to control their commercial interests and investments. And now the next frontier is space, and we're going to take control of that to control our commercial interests and investments. Okay, they're very frank. You know. And then they also pointed out, here they agree with U.S. intelligence projections, that the process of so-called globalization will have exactly the opposite effects of what is predicted. Namely, it will increase it will lead to a widening economic divide, a growing gap between the haves and the have-nots. The U.S. intelligence projections are the same. It'll lead to a growing economic divide, also financial volatility, meaning lower growth. And in this case of, in a situation with a widening economic divide and a growing number of have-nots, it's going to be harder to keep them under control. So therefore we need new devices, like, for example, militarization of space.
Iranian news agency.
Professor, what would be the role and situation of other players, such leaders of Russia, China, France, and others? Will they have to give up to some kind of compromise or what?
Nobody has to do anything. What they are likely to do is pretty much what they are doing. Russia, as I mentioned, has, in the last year, has sharply increased, I think by about 30%, its military spending for offensive military purposes, new offensive weapons, and so on. China is widely expected to do the same, or maybe already be doing the same, in part just in reaction to ballistic missile defense development. I mean, everyone involved in that has predicted that, of course, China is going to respond by increasing its offensive military capacities. Others will respond in other ways. I mean, nobody is going to say, thank you, please cut my throat. If you announce that you're going to attack people at will and destroy them at will, they are likely to find some mode of response. That's why many well-known international scholars have said that these policies tend to increase proliferation of weapons of mass destruction and to increase terror. Those are reactions that people can use. And sooner or later, weapons of mass destruction and terror will come together, maybe right here. It's just a matter of time. So those are possible reactions. There are other things going on as well. I mean, militarily, the world is unipolar. No question about that. I mean, the U.S. probably spends as much as the rest of the world combined or close to it in military force, and is far more advanced. For example, there isn't a space race now because there's only one country racing. When the U.S. is talking about going from control to ownership, it's not as if someone else is interfering with the control. They're not. So overwhelmingly ahead from a military point of view, but not economically. Economically, there have been and are three major economic centers, more or less on a par. Europe, Northeast Asia, Japan, China, South Korea, others interacting with them. They're kind of on a par. Europe is an economic unit of the same category as the United States. Northeast Asia is the most dynamic economic region of the world. It also happens to have about half of global foreign exchange reserves. The former head of Clinton's Council on Economic Advisors, Laura Tyson, really recently described the international economy in four simple words. She said, America spends, Asia lends. And how long that's going to go on, nobody knows. But it's an area which has reserves, which is growing fast, which already has a greater GDP than North America does. Europe is the same. Europe, contrary to a lot of talk, has approximately the same growth level, productivity growth level per capita as the United States, and can go off in its own direction. These are issues that go way back to the end of the Second World War. I mean, right throughout the Cold War, one of the concerns of U.S. planners was that Europe would become what was called a third force. It would go off on its own. Well, that still remains. The end of the Cold War hasn't changed that. And now there are comparable problems in East Asia. A lot of the maneuvering around control over Middle East oil and the lesser but significant Central Asian oil resources, a lot of that maneuvering, including Iran, has to do with who's going to control those energy resources. Because whoever controls them, if the U.S. controls them, as it intends to do, it will have what George Kennan once called veto power over the decisions of other actors. That was 50 years ago. It's even more the case now. So a lot of alternatives.
Tiempo Madrid.
Professor Chomsky, considering the different perceptions that are in America and in Europe, for example, with the rest of the world, on the war in Iraq, on the Middle East, even on the role of the United Nations, what do you think that is the role that the American media plays in forging public opinion and public policy?
There's a lot of study of this. By and large, the media transmit a doctrinal position which is shared by state power, by corporate power, and by the media elites themselves who are part of it. It's easy to document it. If you want a close analysis concerned with Iraq, I'd suggest that you take a look at one careful study done by, which you can pick up on the web, done by the most important public attitude study program in the world. It's the Program on International Policy Attitudes at the University of Maryland, pipa.org. You can pick it up. They did a study about a month ago or so called Misimpressions of Iraq, okay, in which they investigated beliefs that are so obviously outlandish that there's no serious debate about whether they're true or false. And those are the misimpressions of Iraq. And they evaluated them among the public. They're extremely high. But then, in response to your question, they traced those misimpressions to media sources. Okay. Turned out if you're getting people who are getting their news from Fox News, about 80% had at least one serious misimpression, many more. People who were getting their news from major print media, elite print press, about 50% serious misimpression. Those who were getting it from National Public Radio, about 25% serious misimpression. These, incidentally, are misimpressions that I don't think anyone would have in Europe or Asia or anywhere else. And that's a misleading estimate, as they point out, because about 20 to 25% of the public, somewhere in that neighborhood, are getting their information from talk radio. You just turn that on and you'll find out what that means. And among young people, when you sort of break down the demographics, I've forgotten the numbers, but I think a majority from, say, 18 to 22, roughly that range, are getting their news from comic shows that are on television late at night, these political comic shows. Well, we're taking out that piece of the population, but this is an indication of the way effectively the corporate media transmit a kind of propaganda line, not because they are subordinating themselves to it, but because they agree with it.
Professor Chomsky, we clearly could go on all afternoon here. There are a lot of people I can see who would like to ask questions, but we don't have time, and Hans Janacek does want to give you your medal for your sterling work over the years. I'm going to allow my colleagues who need to go off and file to leave, and we'll go to the medal ceremony, and then those who want to stay and ask some questions, perhaps we might be able to squeeze in a few before lunch. Hans.
Professor Chomsky, it's a great honor for us that you accepted our invitation, but even more so that you accepted our award of excellence, which the Society of Writers has been giving annually to outstanding literary and political figures for their contribution to peace and understanding. In fact, over the past 15 or 17 years so far, and it was previously awarded to international statesmen such as Mikhail S. Gorbachev and great writers like Norman Mailer. The members of the society, founded in 1989, are diplomats and journalists accredited to the United Nations, as well as individual staff members with a distinguished literary record. We deeply believe that there is a link between politics or diplomacy on one hand and literary art on the other, because there are many things that you cannot say in a political or diplomatic fashion. You need a literary element. And this is one of the things that we have admired about you for so many years. It's not only what you say, it's how you say it. And you can see what a response you have. And you never raise your voice. And you never swear. And you never hit the table with your fist. You always keep calm, but persuasive. Persuasive indeed. And this is why the citation for the award, which is a medal, I will show it, which is a medal on a blue ribbon with the inscription Ex Mente Orbis, which I would translate as from the spirit of the world. But there are also other interpretations, but what it means really is the conscience of mankind, and that's what it's all about. Professor Chomsky, we honor you today in gratitude. You have kept the flame of reason and common sense alive when they were threatened. You stayed calm in the clash of civilizations, but recorded the conflict in a uniquely somber and persuasive style. Your voice is heard all over the globe. You have earned the respect of millions, eager to find the truth in a troubled world. There is no better place to express our respect to you than here at the United Nations, whose spirit and principles you represent.
Thank you. Very much appreciated, and now I know how my students feel when they get offered the job.
All right. Well, we're going to be taking the professor upstairs to have some lunch shortly. But are there any more questions? Does anybody? Well, I see three hands, so I'm going to take those three questions, and then I'm afraid that's going to be it. Anjali, the pioneer of India.
I think it's okay. I'll just ask my question without mine. Yesterday. Thank you. Yesterday, George Bush, he announced his budget, and there's a increase in defense spending. How alarming is that? Can you comment?
How alarming is the increasing defense spending? Well, I mean, it's alarming in many respects. For one thing, spending on one area provides what are called foregone opportunities. It means you don't spend on another. There are very serious problems in the country that require major spending. I don't have to enumerate them. And there, if you have more spending for what's euphemistically called defense, you don't spend on those other things, so those problems get worse, and they are serious. The military spending itself has two functions. One function is, of course, intimidation and domination. It's what's described in, say, the Clinton era Space Command document, the public document brochure that I quoted, to use military force to secure U.S. investments and commercial interests. And now that means, in accord with the national security strategy, as by now sharpened, according the right to attack anyone you like without pretext, and in accord with the means now available with ownership of space and so on. So that's one aspect, and we don't have to talk about what that implies. It's not pretty. However, there's another aspect to military spending, which is often suppressed. It keeps the economy alive. Now, this is not what's called the military-industrial complex. That's wrong. What's called the new economy, that everyone is so proud of, what Alan Greenspan hails as the result of the entrepreneurial spirit of the free market, and you've heard all of this stuff. Almost all of that comes out of the dynamic state sector of the economy. That's one reason why the third world became the third world, while the first world became the first world. The first world relies on a dynamic state sector, no country more than the United States. So take a look at all the things you use, computers, electronics generally, the internet, trade, which is based on containerization, containers, biotechnology, run through the list. They almost all derive from the state sector. The public, there are devices by which the public pays the costs and shares the risk. And then if anything comes out of it, it's handed over to private power. So like, say, the internet. It was for 30 years, it was in the state sector. That's when all the hard work was done. Around 1995, it was marketable, so it was handed over to private corporations. Computers. Throughout the 1950s, a computer was something about the size of this room, with vacuum tubes blowing up all over the place and paper flooding all over. During the 1950s, under the pretext of air defense, places like MIT, where I am, were able to get computers down to the point where you could sell them to somebody. First Mainframes company was a spin-off from that around 1960. That's why IBM has shifted from making typewriters to making computers. They were part of this. And it's the same with almost the entire dynamic part of the economy. Furthermore, this goes way back in history. If you go back a century, the major engineering problems, metallurgical and engineering problems and mechanical problems, the major ones, the hard ones, had to do with putting huge guns on moving platforms, which were able to hit another moving target, meaning naval guns. That was an extremely difficult problem. It required complicated engineering, electronics, metallurgy, and so on. And it was carried out primarily by the English and the Germans then, under the rubric of defense. But then, of course, it spun off into the automotive industry and all sorts of other things, and it gave the economy of that day. Economic historians of technology point out, maybe accurately, that that the problems of space today are comparable to the problems of naval gunnery 100 years ago, and it'll have the same effect. So that's, without proceeding, that's another part of the defense, so-called defense system. It's a way of socializing risk and cost and creating the profits of the future economy. Everyone, this is all kind of suppressed in a way. So we talk about free markets and the entrepreneurial spirit and everything else, but the actual way the economy works is crucially like this. And that's part of the military system too. You could ask, is it a good thing? Is it nice to have computers and the internet and so on? Well, maybe not. But the real question is that the way to do it? I mean, should the decision to spend public funds to develop computers rather than, say, a health system, should that be made by deceiving people into believing they're being protected from enemies? Or should it be made by the people themselves who are evaluating these decisions? In other words, do we believe in democracy? If we believe in democracy, back in the 1950s, there wouldn't have been, an air defense system designed to create computers that IBM could later sell. There would have been a public informed discussion of whether we want our resources to go into having PCs 25 years from now, or have a decent health care and school and transportation system. I mean, I know which way I would have voted, but it's for people to decide. And those decisions are taken out of people's hands, in large part through the military system. It's another one of the devices for undermining democracy and for creating a particular kind of private-run economy in the future. That's quite apart from its role in use of military force. So all of this has to be considered.
Le Monde.
Hi. I was just wondering, would you have any comment on the presidential race so far?
On the presidential race? Well, no, it's not a great secret that in the United States, elections are basically bought. Large part of the population accepts that as true. So right before the 2000 election, so no Florida trickery, no Supreme Court. Before the election, about 3/4 of the public regarded it as mostly farce, some game involving rich contributors, party bosses, and the public relations industry, huge public relations industry, which trains candidates to keep away from issues to present what are called qualities. You know, I'm a nice guy. To talk about values, but to keep away from the issues that are important to people. And even if they talk about those issues, to do it in such a way that nobody can figure out where they stand, okay, which was essentially the case. That's the attitude of about 75% of the public, and it's not inaccurate. And the result is that whoever can flood the propaganda system overwhelmingly tends to win. You look at the statistics over the years; it's dramatic. Now, in a democratic culture, that concentration of power could be overcome. So, to say, take Brazil, recent case. I mean, in Brazil, concentration of capital, concentration of media is worse than it is here. It's a much more repressive state than here. Here, the state is minimally repressive by comparative standards. Nevertheless, popular organizations were able to reach a level of activism, engagement, in which they were able to overcome these consequences. In the United States right now, that's just not imaginable. It should be, but it isn't. In order to reach the level of, say, Brazil, we would have to have a reconstruction, revitalization of a democratic culture that has been very severely eroded, consciously eroded. I mean, it doesn't just happen by itself. And that's hard work. It's not going to happen by this election. So this election will be like the standard one, I presume, in which it'll be bought. Who's going to buy it? Well, you know, the Bush administration has money coming out of their ears. The financial industry loves them. The pharmaceutical industry is, you know, just salivating over the wonderful gifts they're getting. The rich in general are getting enormous gifts from the administration, and they're going to pay it back because they want this train ride to continue. It's fantastic for the extreme rich and wealthy, the financial institutions, other top sectors of the economy. They love it. So they want it to stay, and that means in the last, no matter what Democrat is nominated, in the last couple of weeks of the election campaign, you can expect a huge PR campaign. I mean, we can guess. Here's one guess as to what it'll be. I mean, just pulling it out of a hat. I mean, if I was Karl Rove, say, planning what's going to happen the last couple of months, I'd say, well, here's a nice scenario. Let's, right before the Democratic convention, let's either kill or capture Osama bin Laden. Almost certain they know where he is. How hard can it be to find somebody in a small area of Afghanistan or Pakistan? So let's wait until right before the Democratic convention. Suddenly kill or capture Osama. Huge victory in the war on terror. Let's, if, say, Kerry runs, let's paste this achievement alongside of a picture of him standing next to Jane Fonda and stabbing our brave boys in the back. And on and on. Then on to the coronation right here in New York by accident, timed with the anniversary of 9/11. I don't have to tell you what that's going to look like. Yeah, I mean, you don't have to be a PR genius to figure out how to do this. So something like that will presumably happen. And unless there's some very surprising changes, it's very hard for me to see how it can fail. I hope it fails, but...
I had said I'd just take one more, but how can I turn down a request like that? So, could you identify yourself? I don't know
Greek
you.
newspaper Ελευθεροτυπία.
Could you repeat that?
Greek newspaper Ελευθεροτυπία.
Greek.
Professor, many people claim that the Republican Party has become the official party of the religious right. What are the consequences of this in the following year? And the second part is why the anti-war movement in the USA was not successful in stopping the war in Iraq. Why couldn't they persuade the public opinion again?
Well, on the first question, yeah, there's no doubt that, the Republican Party is basically a party of the super rich. and they have to have a popular base. And one way in which they've organized the popular base is what are called in the PR industry values. Keep away from issues and focus on values. In other words, don't let people think about the fact that they're not going to have a job. Don't let them think about the fact that in the 20 years since the Republicans basically took over with a little interim, average real wealth has actually declined for about 90% of the population. Don't let them think about that. Don't let them think about the fact that Americans have the highest workload in the world, the lowest benefits, the least social, that the only country with basically no advanced country with no health services. You can't take care of your elderly mother. I mean, don't let people think about that sort of thing. Let them think about rising to heaven when all the evil has been destroyed and the souls are saved, okay? Or let them think about having a lot of guns that they can run around with and kill all the aliens who are going to attack them, or something like that. Let them think about those things, but keep away from the issues. Okay, don't deal with the fact that they really oppose these corporate-run globalization systems. Everybody opposes them, so let's not talk about them. And in fact, let's just keep away from all the issues and focus on values. So yeah, you get a mobilization of the extremist fundamentalist group, which is big in the United States. This goes back to its origins. It's not new. It goes back to the origins of the country, this extreme fundamentalist strain. The people who conquered New England, early, the Pilgrims, they were raving fundamentalist lunatics, who were waving the holy book and declaring themselves the children of Israel and exterminating the Amalekites, and the whole story. And it's for various reasons it stayed like that. It didn't become a major political phenomenon until Carter. Carter, who I presume was sincere, presented himself as a pious Christian. And that it was clearly understood pretty well that that's an electoral gambit that we can use. Since that time, just about every candidate for president, almost every one, pretends to be a very religious, Christian. Like Bill Clinton made sure that every Monday morning there'd be a photograph in the newspaper about him lustily singing prayers at the Baptist so-and-so. What's going on in his mind is anybody's question. But this is just a precondition for entering the political system ever since this was discovered. And it's a way of keeping people away from the issues. Just like, in fact, if you take a look at the last election, year 2000, Bush managed to get a roughly 50-50 split by getting a large white working class vote, and where the two main issues were not my job or the trade issues I hate or that kind of stuff. The two main issues were religiosity and guns. Okay, that's running a successful campaign. Keep entirely away from the issues that bother people and just go to something you can throw them red meat on. So yeah, that's a connection that's real. There was a second part.
About the anti-war movement.
Oh, the anti-war movement? Well, I think it's a funny question to ask. It's like asking why in 1962 didn't the anti-war movement succeed in stopping the U.S. attack against South Vietnam? Well, one reason is there wasn't any anti-war movement. Okay, why didn't the anti-war movement in France in 1950 prevent France from reinvading their former colony? Same answer, there wasn't any anti-war movement. By now, opposition to war has reached far greater proportions. By now, you can have massive anti-war movements even before a war is officially declared. So it's true, it didn't quite succeed in stopping it, but that's an enormous change over earlier years. In the case of Vietnam, for example, it was 7 or 8 years before there was any visible anti-war movement. By then, South Vietnam was virtually destroyed. In the case of the French conquest of Vietnam, nothing, destroyed. Yeah, a couple of people protested, but no movement. And those are changes over the years. When the Belgians, got rid of Lumumba and took over the Congo, see any protests? No, it's become a much more civilized world since then. So yeah, we should be thankful for that. There's never been anything like the protests last February. Never, here or anywhere else. Is it enough to stop another act of aggression? Well, maybe not, but it's certainly a lot better than ever was.
So could you identify yourself?
My name is Chike Moma. I'm a retired librarian from the United Nations. 1990, I retired. I do not represent any newspaper. I have a question that to which there might not be an easy answer. The Berlin Conference of 1886 imposed boundaries on African countries, and with which we have had to live for 20, 30 years. Do you think that the United Nations should take the lead in freeing Africa from the burden of these imposed boundaries that have no logic whatsoever in considerations of the ethnicities involved? The prime example is Nigeria, of course, from which I come, where we have struggled we've struggled endlessly with the ethnicities, the diversities, which diversity is good in America. Diversity in Nigeria has given us a lot of trouble. Is it reasonable for the world to lift this burden from off the African shoulders so that peoples that cannot live together can peacefully be helped to separate if they have the potential for viability? In the intervening years, little Czechoslovakia has peacefully split into two. Things are going on in Yugoslavia, in the Soviet Union, where peoples have separated, not always peacefully, but I know in Nigeria, Biafra tried to separate and was crushed. So my question simply is, should there not be an end to the burden of the Berlin Conference of 1886? Thank you.
I actually think that's a subcase of a much broader question. First, the narrow question, should the world overcome this problem for Africa? They say the UN. I don't think so. I think those are problems that have to be overcome in Africa. I think Africans should overcome that problem in their way with whatever support and sympathetic support the rest of the world can give them. However, these problems, as you say, are not unique to Africa. This is the development of the modern nation-state system in the last hundreds of years. I mean, Europe, which is the center of it, was the bloodiest and most savage part of the world for hundreds of years because Europeans were slaughtering each other, trying to establish a totally insane system, namely the nation-state system, which, exactly as you say, just in Europe, doesn't correspond to what people's cultures are, what their connections are, what their languages are, whatever. It's just some irrational system of force and domination that is imposed on people with tremendous violence. I mean, that's how Europe developed the kind of culture of violence which allowed it to conquer the world. They were very practiced in slaughtering each other. Like the 30 Years' War alone, that led to the Treaty of Westphalia, probably killed about maybe 40% of the population of Germany. These were not little things. In fact, it would still be going on. And there's a lot of talk in political science about democratic peace. Democratic countries don't go to war. Well, you can look at the statistics, but there's one fundamental reason why you're getting any results at all. In 1945, Europeans, the democratic countries, realized that the next time they play their traditional game of slaughtering each other will be the last, because they had constructed means of destruction so fantastic that this game is just over. Okay, did it for the last 500 years. We can't do it anymore. So we're not going to fight each other anymore. We'll fight defenseless people, but not each other, because otherwise it's over. You can't do it. So yes, there's a kind of a democratic peace. Does that mean that for Europe this is the right system? No, it's a highly artificial system. In Europe too. That's why you see in Europe, in opposition to the centralizing tendencies of the European Union, there are also regional tendencies developing. So if you look at Spain and England and other parts of Europe, there's a kind of devolution going on into regions that are more autonomous, that are reviving independent local cultures and languages. And I think that's a very healthy development in my view. And not just for, and this, in the rest of the world, most of the conflicts that are going on, not just Africa, Asia, Middle East, everywhere else, are the results of Europe's forceful imposition of the state system, okay, in a way which had nothing to do with the people. I mean, what's Iraq? Well, Iraq was created by the British in order to ensure that they would have the oil, not Turkey, and that the country wouldn't have an access to the sea so they could control it, okay, and make it free and democratic. And that's the same everywhere you look. I mean, personal remark, I happen to be under investigation by the state security courts in Turkey because of a talk that I gave in Diyarbakir, southeast Turkey, in which I said something nice about the Ottoman Empire. I didn't suggest that we should go back to the Ottoman Empire, a lot of rotten things about it, but I did say I thought in many respects the Ottoman Empire had the right idea. There was a center, which fortunately was very corrupt, so it didn't interfere with people too much. But for the most part, it left people alone to run their own affairs. So, an Armenian part of, Lebanon could run its affairs, and somebody else could run something else. And you could travel from one place to another without having a visa, And the local regions were pretty much autonomous and federated and related and so on and so forth. And that's a pretty sensible way for the world to be organized, I think. But that means unraveling a complex system of nation states, now very tightly linked to private power, because they're called multinational corporations, but they heavily rely on their home state for all kinds of support, financial, cost and risk provision, military support, and so on and so forth. So this whole kind of thing has to be slowly unraveled, and I don't think there's any formula for it. It's really going to have to be done by people themselves, coming to terms with this destructive residue of history. I mean, take the United States. Take the U.S.-Mexico boundary. Okay, what's that? I mean, half of Mexico was conquered by the United States. Okay, now it's called the United States. The Mexican-U.S. border was, like most borders, was a result of conquest. It wasn't a natural border. It was a very porous border. So people of the same, similar people lived on both sides, and they tended to move up and back. In 1994, something interesting happened. In 1994, NAFTA was passed with a lot of rhetoric about how we're unifying, North America and so on and so forth. Also in 1994, Clinton, who was no fool, militarized the border for the first time. Operation Gatekeeper. Militarized the border to make sure that people wouldn't move up and back. Capital, yeah, but not people. So we got to stop this free movement of people up and back across a rather porous border and impose a border that's semi-porous. Capital goes up and back easily, but not people, because these systems are not designed for people. They're designed for capital. And since then, you get hundreds of people being killed on the border and so on and so forth. Well, that border shouldn't be there, just like other borders shouldn't. But those are things that are going to have to be changed internally through understanding and, social evolution of it and social change. I don't think they can be imposed from the outside.
Professor Noam Chomsky, it's been fascinating. Thanks so much.
You stink.